those who are going to be helping us with these questions are Stephen P. Cohen, known as one of the fathers of Track 2 diplomacy in the Middle East. He has a PhD in social psychology from Harvard and has taught at Harvard and held visiting professorships at Princeton, at Hebrew University, at Lehigh, and at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Richard Fern, a social ethicist, served on the faculty of Yale Divinity School with a joint appointment in the School of Forestry and Environmental Sciences, during which time he helped to develop a joint degree program in environmental ethics between our two schools. He holds a PhD from Yale in philosophy and religious studies, an MTH from Southern Methodist University, and also a JD from Yale Law School. Rabbi James Ponet was named the first Howard M. Holtzman Jewish chaplain at Yale, following the endowment of the chaplaincy by the Honorable Howard Holtzman in December of 2000. He serves as the director of the Joseph Slifka Center for Jewish Life at Yale. He has a BA in religious studies from Yale and a Master of Hebrew Letters from Hebrew Union College. And John Reeder is professor of religious studies at Brown University. His area of expertise include Western philosophy and Christian ethics, and has comparative interests in Judaic and Buddhist thought. He has degrees, all of them, BA, BD, MA, and PhD from Yale. So I'm delighted to have this distinguished panel with us, and we'll simply go in alphabetical order. So we'll ask, first of all, Stephen Cohen to give us his further assessment of the issues we're discussing.
I'm very glad to be with you today, and I am very appreciative of this new initiative of Yale Divinity School. And I want to say how important I do believe the issue of reconciliation is at this time in the history of the world. And it seems to me that even though people felt that there was more passion in yesterday's discussion than in today's, I want to bring some of the passion that I feel from my work, which is the passion of being concerned that we go out of this period of terrible killing of each other that is going on throughout the world, often in the name of religious commitment, into a period in which the commitments of faith of all of the people of the region would be turned towards trying to find peaceful way of living with each other, respect for each other, and reconciliation among the faiths. It seems to me that the absence of Judaism in the discussion until now has had an important effect on the way the discussion has gone forward. If we had had Judaism together with Islam and Christianity, I think we would have had more emphasis on the notion of the common elements of the Abrahamic religions. And that would have given us a direction of reconciliation rather than the direction of argument and mutual criticism. It seems to me that beginning with the notion of the shared Abrahamic tradition, we would have seen that we have in common some very important principles, both for religion and politics. The first of those principles is the common sense of creation, and that means that from one man and one woman we all come. And that means that we all have a shared identity in our relationship to the Creator. And it seems to me that that would be a very important place to begin with providing a basis of common religious tradition which would give us respect for each other and respect for all people, all individuals in each society. If you turn towards the particular experience of Judaism, the basic idea that leads to a democratic belief in Judaism comes from the fundamental idea of covenant. The idea of covenant is that the relationship between man and God is a two-directional relationship, not only a one-directional relationship. It's not only a matter of commander and commanded, but actually we are both part of the process of going from the creation, the original creation, towards redemption. The improvement and repair of the world is a common, shared tradition and responsibility of both God and man. And that notion of a shared responsibility through covenant is the essential idea that underpins the legitimacy of a democratic approach to governance in Judaism. Now, it is true, and it's a very important part of the issue of Judaism, that Jewish law, and the more correct term, halacha, which is different than law, it means a way of living, that halacha developed while Jews were always in exile, and therefore it never carried with it the enforcement of a state. It operated outside the state system, and therefore it had to develop resources for self-enforcement because it did not have a state to enforce the law. And that's a very important part of the history of the relationship between Jews and democracy, in that when democracy came to states in which Jews lived, the first main effect of that was that Jews found themselves in a situation in which the local community's residual authority in establishing religious courts was withdrawn. And Jews had to experience how they could maintain the structure of their communities and the structure of the authority of halacha without that separate community status. At the same time, of course, it became essential that Jews deal with the problem of how they could live in those societies without the process of being forced to give up their religious commitments. And this remains a problem for Jews and the perception that Jews have of their place in the world ever since. Now, Judaism has to deal with the very basic aspect of itself, which is that it is a community that we are responsible to. The idea of Eidah, the idea of the community as being the basic structure in which Judaism exists. And therefore, the first and most difficult aspect of explaining Judaism to non-Jews is to explain to them that the notion of religion in Judaism cannot separate out halacha from the community in which it is going to live. And therefore, the nature of Judaism is necessarily linked to the nature and existence of the Jewish people. And this is often very hard for non-Jews to understand and accept. Now, since I said from the beginning that I am more concerned as a social psychologist about how these issues of religion and politics are being played out in the real world in terms of the amount of conflict, hatred, and violence that is taking place now between the West and the Arab world, between Israel and Arabs, that my concern is to be direct about the issues that bring about this conflict. And so you are interested not only in the historical aspect of Judaism, but the question of how these ideas of Judaism have been brought about into reality in the situation in which the first time in 2,000 years the Jews have a state, and how that state is acting out the ideas that are basic to democracy. And we mean by that not only elections, we've too much talked about that aspect of democracy, but more about the respect for others, the freedom of religion, and so on. And these are very difficult and complicated issues about the relationship between Israel and the Palestinian population within Israel and the Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza. And it has been a very important part of the development of Israel as a state to deal with the way that a secular state, which Israel was designed to be, would deal with the religious issues. It's very important to know that the religious Zionists were not a dominant force in the creation of Israel in most of its history. That they had to accept a minority status within Israel. And in fact, the way that Israel dealt with the issue of religious Jews was that there were created a number of religious parties, political parties, which represented interests of the religious communities, Jewish religious communities of Israel. These religious parties emphasized certain aspects of the nature of the state to reflect a Jewish ethos. First of all, most important was the fact that the day of rest was going to be the Jewish Sabbath, not Friday and not Sunday, but Saturday. Second of all, that national institutions, state institutions, would, by and large, accept the religious laws of kashrut, kosher food, in the military, in the Knesset, and in other national institutions, kosher food would be served. And that the holidays observed would be the Jewish holidays from biblical times, and, as I said, the Sabbath especially. But many other aspects of the demands of the religious community were not accepted by the secular majority in Israel. And this created a number of important examples of conflict within the Jewish society of Israel. We'll talk about the conflicts between the Jewish society and the Arab society of Israel in a moment, but within Jewish society, what this meant was that there was a conflict, for example, in certain areas where religious Jews lived. They did not want secular Jews to be able to drive through those neighborhoods on the Sabbath, and they would stone those cars. And it was a matter of severe tensions between religious and non-religious elements of the society. Now, in Israel's Declaration of Independence, there was a strong statement of freedom of religion and that non-Jewish citizens of the society would have the same full rights as Jews. They would be able to vote, they would be able to run for parliament, and they would be able to have their own educational system and their own religious system. Now, the truth is that maintaining that principle of full equality before the law was a difficult thing to maintain because in the early years of the history of the state, there was a big question that Israelis raised about how loyal those Arab citizens would be to the state. And so they were concerned about the security that would come from giving them full freedom of access and freedom of movement. Some of that has been overcome by the abolition of military government, but not all of it has been abolished, because what happens in a long tradition of institutionalized discrimination, it becomes part of the way that people look at life, and they begin to internalize some of the attitudes of discrimination. So that, for example, even though it is legal for people to live in the same neighborhoods and in the same apartment buildings, it is not always the case, and too often not the case, that landlords will not rent apartments in mixed neighborhoods to non-Jews. Sometimes they say that it's because of security concerns, but there is no question that those security concerns have long since spread over into a habit of discrimination, ethnic discrimination. And that has to be overcome. It's a big struggle. Even more important to most people than these concerns about the equal rights of the Palestinian citizens of Israel itself is the question of how Israel has come to occupy the West Bank and, until recently, Gaza, and of course, Jerusalem. And here we deal with the practical experience of Jews in what happened when the religious community of Israel began to take a much more activist and militant position about its ability to determine the future of the state. This happened after the 1973 war, when the secular leadership of the country was in shambles after the surprise of the 1973 war and lost a lot of its confidence and a lot of its belief in itself, and that people began to have serious questions about whether that secular leadership could continue to lead the country. Religious Zionists started to think that they would have the answer as to how to give the whole society a new elan and a new sense of confidence by putting the religious community at the forefront, at the vanguard of Israeli society, and they would do so by emphasizing the occupation of Eretz Yisrael, of the land of Israel in supposedly biblical definition, or at least some of the areas which were very important in earlier periods of Jewish history, places like Hebron and so on, and that they would be the pioneers of settling in those areas and would give a new direction and energy to the society by emphasizing that settlement policy. The religious Jews knew that in the early history of Zionism, they had played a minor role in the development of the state and the development of settlement. But now they felt they had their chance because others were depressed and they would take the lead. And they developed a militant movement which believed that Israel as a government did not have the right to make decisions to relinquish territory which was part of the biblical promise. And they felt that the biblical promise overrid any right of government to make decisions about that territory. And that was a big struggle that Israel went through over the last many years, which is whether or not the status of the Israelis in the occupied territories was a biblical command which overrid the power of government to reverse it, or whether or not a secular, democratically elected government could decide to give up territory, even territory that was considered sacred territory. And over the last year, for the first time, when Israel made a decision to leave a significant number of settlements that it had created in Gaza and some in the West Bank, there was a huge struggle between the religious community and the secular community in Israel. And the religious community found that the larger community, the majority, the secular majority, would not support the maintenance of the settlements against the decision of the government. They simply would not do it. And the religious community was very disappointed because it believed that it held the veto over that decision, and that if it stood up and protested strongly, the government would have to withdraw and would not be able to carry out those decisions. So here was a practical case in which the authority, the religious authority, which a certain group of Israelis took to themselves, it was not primarily coming from religious leaders themselves, although there were a number of rabbis who, in the West Bank, in the occupied territories, who strongly supported these settlers and took a lead with them. But it was primarily the settlers themselves who attributed to themselves the authority to override government decisions. But the people would not accept it, and the government was able to carry out its decision. So, what I'm saying to you here is that within Judaism right now, these issues that we've been discussing have an enormous historical, concrete meaning, which is when will the government have the authority, and when will it be overridden by claims of biblical authority? Now, there are many other things that need to be said here. I'm not going to take any more time away from the rest of the panel. But I do want to say again that from my point of view, what is clearly important here is that we try to put some emphasis on the shared sources of the Abrahamic religions so that we begin to discover some of the spiritual commonalities, shared visions that will give us a chance to get out of what we have created here, which is one of the more dangerous times in human history, where conflict is becoming worldwide again. And let us hope that we will find the strength within Christianity, Islam, and Judaism to emphasize the ideas of brotherhood and love over the ideas of ethnic superiority.
Let me begin by expressing not only my delight and honor in being here, but also my great delight at seeing this conference take place. I can remember it must have been almost 12 years now at a faculty conference discussing the future of the Divinity School, and as part of that discussion, the possibility of the Divinity School serving as a focal point, a place for discussions between Christians, Jews, and Muslims came up. And I'm delighted after all these years to see this taking place, and I look forward to it continuing. I just want to say, by way of leading into my remarks, that I think that this underlying question as to whether or not we can get along, where we go from here, is in the final analysis not going to be answered by, though certainly all these will contribute to an answer, it's not going to be answered by historical inquiry, political theory, or even theological reflection, but it's going to depend upon what we choose to do, the kind of people we choose to be, and the things that we value most. I entitled my remarks Commonalities and Differences. Secularism of the sort advocated by strict separationists appears to be breathing its last. Liberal theorists have not succeeded in drawing a persuasive line between religious convictions and the no less contentious beliefs on which secularists rely in the setting of public policy. Further, even as this debate continues, it is likely citizens of liberal democracies, confronted by increasingly severe ecological and social crises, will turn to religious faith for support and guidance. This is not necessarily a good thing. I remember reading as a young high school student that bloody tome, Fox's Book of Martyrs, not a few of whose subjects would have been relieved to find themselves beheaded. It was no less dangerous in 16th century Europe to adopt a religion other than that of the majority than it is now in 16th century Afghanistan. Religion can be a dangerous thing. That it can does not, of course, entail that allowing religious convictions to shape public policy is unwise. For one thing, it is evident that the absence of religious convictions is no bar to moral atrocity. It may also be that including religious convictions in the public debate will minimize the danger from destructive forms of faith, perhaps even render society more humane and democratic. A close look at history, one that goes beyond the popular Monty Pythonist image of unrelenting warfare between Promethean secularists and diabolical theocrats, shows this to be so. The rise of liberal democracy owes more to changes in religious sensitivity and fervor than it does secular political philosophy or philosophers. The line path from Winthrop to Washington runs through the moralistic do-goodism of Cotton Mather and the pietistic revivalism of Jonathan Edwards. It continues right through the strangely warmed hearts of Methodists, the free silver agenda of Bryant, and the social gospel of Rauschenbusch, all outworkings of a progressive patriotic Protestantism. In short, the conflict of religion with democracy, like that with science, turns out to be only one aspect of a more complicated positive relation than that portrayed in the myths of secularity. That religion, like love, has proven a source of harm, even evil, is no more reason to give up on it than love, as though the height of wisdom in affairs of heart or state were that of a disenchanted youth. What we need at this point is to move beyond debates about legitimacy and risk, secularism and theocracy, and inquire how religious convictions can play a positive role in the building of a more just and good society. Doing so will require us to envision a way in which religious convictions and conflict, commonalities and differences can be made part of that war by other means on which every pluralistic democratic society relies. I explore this possibility, among others, in a book I recently wrote entitled Nature, God, and Humanity. There I inquire as to how religious believers can engage questions regarding the nature and extent of our moral obligations to wild nature in a way that is true to their basic convictions, yet respectful of cultural particularities and the well-established results of critical academic inquiry. I want here, leaving aside the particular analysis and arguments, to comment on several aspects of that project which facilitate, in my view, a reliance on religious convictions in the setting of public policy. To begin, my intent in writing the book was not to set forth a determinate environmental ethic, that is, identify moral wrongs and morally mandated responses. While flagging what I take to be real moral problems, I do so by way of illustrating a more abstract concern with the manner in which religious considerations bear on public issues. This was not because I do not care about the rectification of moral wrongs, but rather because I hope to advance that end more effectively by coming to terms with a logically and I believe politically prior issue. The failure to address this issue is closely related to the fear of theocracy. Secularism as a political philosophy is defined not by a set of moral conclusions or policy directives, but rather a way of thinking about the world, negatively and vaguely defined to be sure, but still an operative form of reflection and inquiry, not a particular agenda. That is what makes it, however adequate, a dialogue starter. When religious beliefs enter the public arena, however, it tends to be in the form of particularized conclusions, redemptive agendas, pontifications which appear to spring, however wise, full-blown from the head of God. Correspondingly, right and left, religiously fueled participants in the public debate tend to dismiss the dissenting views of other religiously fueled advocates as obviously mistaken and often as motivated by less than admirable ends. In short, as unworthy of serious consideration. One's own position, on the other hand, is presumed to be congruent with the best of secular reasoning. It is hardly surprising, then, that reflective persons argue that religious considerations are either argumentatively redundant or inherently flawed. What one misses in the public debate is any sense of how conflicting religiously motivated advocates might interact with one another in a critical, constructive manner. It is this which gives force to Rorty's claim that appeals to religion are conversation stoppers, leaving differing advocates with nothing to do but duke it out. To rebut this claim, we must step back from the question of truth, however hard that is, and look to clarify the context and force, the internal logic, as it were, of our discourse. This need not involve a high-flying, all-encompassing theory of the sort philosophers adore. Only a reasonably clear notion of how religious beliefs and values can be critically, constructively engaged. Until we have some sense of this dynamic, and with it the value for us of religious dialogue and even disputation, appeals to religious faith will continue to function as conversation stoppers. I choose, by way of illustrating this dynamic, to focus on theism, and more particularly what I call traditional biblical theism, by which I mean roughly belief in an almighty and wholly good, world-transcending and radically free, irreducibly personal, supreme reality, the kind of deity believed in by many conservative Christians and Muslims and Jews. One reason I did so is that I am a traditional biblical theist. A second reason was political. Traditional biblical theists have great political power in America and the world at large. Accordingly, we need to get them involved in a constructive, morally informed manner. Politically, I would like to see traditional biblical theists adopt a more ecologically sensitive and animal-friendly ethic than many currently do. Toward this end, I offer, within the context of my book, a comprehensive and I hope persuasive argument. At the same time, I do not look to put or attempt to put the mantle of divine authority on my conclusions. While, as a traditional biblical theist, I do believe myself to be working, thinking within the framework of divine revelation, the particular political and moral conclusions I draw relative to public policy are my own, wise and true, let us hope, yet my view still not an unquestionable word from on high. Thus, I look, in addition to presenting my own views, to show those who disagree with me on policy issues how they can develop their own religiously fueled convictions in a critical, informed, and thereby more persuasive manner. My goal is twofold: to persuade them, if I can, but in any case, enable them to think more clearly and effectively. The upshot is that even if public policy lags behind what I believe it ought to be, it ends up more enlightened than it might otherwise be, and most important, the level of public discourse is raised. It is crucial that in engaging others, we do not assume they are idiots or moral retards because they advocate policies we regard as unwise or even morally distressing, say drilling for oil in the Arctic National Refuge. Whether or not there is a right to ridicule, as Dworkin argues in reference to the recent cartoon incident, we need to bear in mind the potentially harmful effects of ridicule. Thus, while I agree with many panentheists as regards environmental policy, I fear that their expressed disdain for and distorting ridicule of traditional biblical theism may end up doing more harm than good, encouraging the ridiculed to overlook the positive potential inherent in their faith, a potential, like all positive potentials, we ought to encourage, not to denigrate. Citizens of a liberal democracy need to find ways of positively engaging, even valuing positions with which they strongly disagree. Of course, there will be limits, positions we ought not to respect. Determining what those limits are is one of the, if not the major task of liberal democracy in our day, a task made all the more pressing by the demise of secularism and its alleged higher order neutrality. Whatever limits we draw, however, the existence of a genuinely pluralistic democratic society directly depends on our ability as religious believers and citizens to distinguish between error and abomination. If we constantly confuse these and subsequently refuse to talk with or respect anyone with whom we disagree significantly, anyone of the other party, you know what that party is, we are bound to end up in a state of chaos or a coercively unified totalitarian society, be it left or right, theocratic or secular. Let me, in conclusion, note one last way in which I sought to foster a healthy diversity of opinion. In formulating my theology of creation, I was greatly helped by Kabbalistic speculations about the nothing out of which God creates the world. These set up my account of constitutive divine love, and therewith my claim that the world, rather than being the body of God, as panentheists are prone to claim, is more properly viewed as the body of humanity. Now, in the original longer manuscript from which my book was condensed, this characterization leads me into the domain of Christology. The body of humanity turns out to be that of Christ Jesus, the second Adam, and incarnate deep telos of creation. The thing is that in putting together the book, I realized that by setting these claims aside, I was left with a way of thinking about nature, qua creation, open to affirmation by Muslims, Jews, and Christians, among others. I opted for the more general, abstract approach. Why? Because it makes clear that religious faith is not a monolithic, ideologically unified whole. To the contrary, there are some respects in which the views of some Christians on matters at the very core of their faith are closer to those of some Jews and Muslims than they are to those of other Christians. What makes this interesting from the standpoint of our inquiry is that it allows for complex cross-hatching and thereby the interwoven web of political alliances crucial to the unity of a pluralistic society. Of course, as time and occasion allow, we will want to expand this interwoven web in associated dialogue to include non-theists, Buddhists, Hindus, Wiccans, the whole glorious cacophony of faith, atheists too. In all this, there is no one sphere, no logically primal preferred locus of discourse, no original position encompassing all of the people with whom we happen to dwell. We talk with those we can as need arises. Sometimes we need to narrow the context of reflection, sometimes broaden it. The crucial thing is that our convictions sustain, never suspend, a lively exchange of views. It is a good thing to have people with whom you disagree, even about God. Thank you.
I'm aware of time as a person to this program, and I know the Muslims have an...
Yeah, actually, we can extend it as long as the prayer starts before 1 o'clock, I'm told. Okay?
Thank you. In addition, I want to say that I've been at Yale as Jewish chaplain for 25 years, and it is indeed, as I think both Richard noted and as Stephen expressed, a turning point in my experience at this university and under the leadership of Dean Attridge, that this Divinity School, which has held out in a very interesting way as a center of Christian thought, didn't go the way of Harvard becoming a center for world religion, that this Divinity School has dramatically recognized global responsibility and the need for that word that Professor Amanat rightly problematized, the need for dialogue. And is doing so in a very dramatic way now, and this conference is an expression of that. Indeed, at a time, as Stephen Cohen said, of great danger in the world. I, as a religionist, have, over the last several years, come to the conclusion that religion is not the solution, at least not monotheistic Abrahamic religion, but in fact, we are the problem. And I think we got a whiff of that today. Unlike Professor Cohen, I'm not confident that had Jews and Judaism been part of the conversation from the very beginning, that we would have achieved some kind of Abrahamic harmony. On the contrary, I think we would have come to a quicker clarification of the conflicts. Because in some deep sense, I, as a Jew, experienced that there really wasn't a conversation happening, and maybe wrong, but it was my experience between the Muslim panel and the Muslim presentation by Professor Zaman and the original one by Professor O'Donovan yesterday in that panel. It struck me that a couple of poignant things linger in my mind, and I'm using this chance at reassessment to address them, since I think Professor Cohen performed a very critical Jewish task in describing the the theocratic, democratic situation of Jews, both historically, textually, and currently. So I was struck when Professor O'Donovan responded to Professor Serene Jones that indeed you got my number. There's an enormous abyss between us Europeans and the way we see the world and the way you Americans do. And he gave an example that was stunning and important as regards the status of religion. He said the Prime Minister, in a sentence of England, the Prime Minister used the term God in a context that seemed, I think, neutral to all of us in this room, and, quote, was nearly crucified for saying, well, God will see, which is the right view. So we have a country, presumably representative of Europe, Britain is part of Europe now, supposedly, in which the word God coming from the mouth of the Prime Minister is dangerous. I mean, use the term crucifixion and a fatwa against the Prime Minister for the utilization of that term. And one can imagine the opposite in the Muslim world, that a Muslim leader today is endangered if he flags too secular, too unreligious, or wrongly religious view, hence the poignant reference to the problem of apostasy and so forth. So in Islam today, God is something that people kill for, and in Christianity today, or in England today, an antithetical phenomenon, just very striking to ponder. America is a religious country, and it was last night that Professor Stephen Cohen asked a very poignant question to the panel. He said, can anybody in the panel address the destabilizing effect of America as regards violence in the world today? Can anybody address that issue? And lingering under that question, I think was the issue of the relationship between America and the church. Let's say, is America a Christian country? Is this president who, one of the panelists noted that our incumbent president, after 9/11, referred to himself as having been brought to this position for a purpose, and she noted, I think that was Michelle coming, and she noted that he was referencing the book of Esther. Interestingly, just an erudite point that is somehow significant to this Jewish mind, in the book of Esther, when Mordecai says to her, maybe it was for this reason that you became the queen of the empire, he refrains significantly from using the word God. The word God is absent significantly in the book of Esther, which I've always thought has something to do with how one conducts religious conversations in a world where God is hiding God's face, where God's presence is, as Buber noted in The Eclipse of God, essentially absent. How do you talk about the absent? Maybe by not naming it. In any event, the question of what America's role is in the world today awakened for me the question that I think is implicit in the idea of reconciliation mentioned last night by Professor Wolf, and that is, nobody said it, so I feel like I'm maybe risking speaking about the elephant in the room, but are we engaged in a war or not? And if we are engaged in a war, I mean, it seems obvious that we are, but it's not a draft war. When I was a student at Yale, there was no question that America was engaged in a war. And I think that has much to do with the way this war is being prosecuted with a small army of volunteers. If we are engaged in a war, is this war about America that Professor Cohen referred to, fighting for its interests in the Middle East, or is it, as Samuel Huntington and others have taught us to construe it, a civilizational war? In fact, is this a war of Christianity against Islam, or radical Islam, as some people want to phrase it? And the question is terribly pointed right here on campus. As I said to Professor Zaman yesterday when we were talking, the New York Times just 2 weeks ago published a story about a young man who studies at Yale now from Afghanistan, formerly a spokesperson for the Taliban. Syed Rahmatullah Hashemi is his name. It was a very beautiful article in the Times, and I think initially Yale felt good about that article. And then suddenly the right-wing commentators in this country, most notably Fox News and certain writers in the Wall Street Journal, op-ed page, reminded this country that we're at war and this man is part of the enemy, and that his views are anathema, and that should Yale, and then came the World War II analogies, should Yale in 1941, would Yale have accepted Goebbels as a student? This kind of question characterized the level of discourse. But the point is, does this man have a place at Yale? Does he not have to recant his views? And all of these questions, of course, were premised on the simple and sort of dulled fact. There is a war going on, and what is the nature of that war? Is it, in fact, a war of religions? And then, finally, coming back to my status as a Jew, I think I heard Professor Griffel say that the issue of democracy is not real, and it's not an issue in the Middle East. Democracy is, how did he phrase it? I actually wrote it down. There are no real democracies, he said, in the Middle East. So that statement, of course, is true as regards the Arab Middle East. The single exception, of course, is the Jewish state, whose democratic status can be contested the way any serious democracy, I suppose, can, the way the very definition of democracy can be, whether representational democracy is truly democracy, what are the difference between the republic and the democracy and so forth, and the whole problem of multiculturalism in the state, et cetera, et cetera. These issues can all be brought, but Israel was founded, as Professor Cohen noted, as a democratic secular state. It obviously has not achieved its ideal, but it exists there. And it is a bastion of democracy. Some would say a destabilizing and terrible force in the Middle East, but it's there. And it symbolizes, therefore, in some significant way, something other than what Professor Wolf opened us up with, opened up his panel with last night, and I think I conclude here. He said the reason we have Jews on the concluding panel is that we see Islam and Christianity, of course, as having emerged from Judaism, and in order for us to talk seriously about what's going on, we need to have reference to the Ur tradition. And that's not a direct quote, of course. It strikes me that let me phrase this properly, if you will, for one moment, and then I'll pass off to you, sir. The Jewish phenomenon of a reborn state after 2,000 years has indeed made Judaism part of a conversation that it wouldn't have been 60 years ago, less than 60 years ago, when that state didn't exist. That state has given a prominence and a significance to Judaism that in fact it's because of the state that I think Professor Cohen and myself are here. And that state in the Middle East, which is a vital democracy, is poised, I think, in some significant way between Islam and Christianity. And in fact, as the Muslims argue among themselves about the nature of how they will go about struggling with the questions of democracy and law, I recognize as a Jew the same issues that we deal with intimately. And yet when I hear Professor O'Donovan talk about how liberalism, with which he's got some problems, it's essentially, a form of, well, it's the inheritance or the contribution or a derivative of Christianity. My mind goes as follows. The Christian world indeed struggles for hegemony. Professor Zaman began his description with taking us to India as a prime example, that colonial country in which Christian Britain established the rudiments of a democracy that make it indeed arguably the largest democracy in the world today, India. But of course, as a Muslim, what Professor Zaman had us understand is there had to be a partition there in the aftermath of British imperialism, as there was in the Middle East between Palestinians and Jews. The legacy of the British Empire in the Middle East and in the subcontinent still troubles the world deeply. The colonial legacy leaves vestiges of humiliation and anger and rage that have not been erased. And as a Jew with deep connections to the Middle East. I recognize that Judaism and Jews are, in some deep sense, caught between two very powerful forces. And whether we could be, in some way, a vehicle for reconciliation, for communication, as Professor Cohen, I think, implicitly suggests, is open. I hope we can. And I'm deeply gratified to be here in some curious sense in that role with the rest of you at this conference. And I'm grateful to the Center for Faith and Culture here and to Divinity School. Thank you very much.
Greetings. I'm grateful to all of you for having me and for all I've learned here. I'm afraid you're going to think I haven't learned enough, however. I feel somewhat like a dinosaur. I am still interested in public reason and an overlapping consensus. So I regard myself as some sort of Paleolithic neoliberal in this very advanced society here. So I'll give you a very brief sketch of where I am, and I hope to make some contact with Professor O'Donovan and others as well. A common fear, a common respect. Both religious believers and secular liberals, it seems to me, have a common fear. They fear being legally coerced on the basis of beliefs they do not share. They are willing to accept coercion, the rule of law, when the grounds of law are ones they accept. But secular liberals fear biblically based legislation. Professor O'Donovan, speaking for himself and other like-minded Christians, argues that when we are compelled to act in ways that we cannot justify within our beliefs, so that we cannot account for what we have done to ourselves and others as an exercise of our own practical reason, we find ourselves in a position of impotence. And when public order presents us with demands that cannot be so justified, we experience that order as coercive and unfree. It seems to me, as I am confessing, since confession seems to be the order of the day, that the power of Rawlsian political liberalism, and also many similar proposals from other traditions, as my colleague Professor Zaman has informed us, the power of this tradition is that it proposes to locate an overlapping consensus of moral agreements about politics so that neither secular liberals or an O'Donovan believer must suffer, in Robert Aldi's phrase, alienating coercion. It seems to me that neither party wants to experience that sort of coercion, and that both parties usually acknowledge on their own grounds that it is a form of coercion that no one should have to accept. Thus, the bottom line, coercive policy should be enacted only on grounds all can share. But what of the objection that Professor Donovan makes that the overlapping consensus endorsed by the various parties on the Rawlsian scheme cannot be so neatly separated from their comprehensive moral and religious visions? Now, my sense is that this objection should be granted. Not only is the consensus to be endorsed by the various comprehensive views, but continual reference must be made to comprehensive views to develop the consensus over time. As such, moreover, the consensus is not merely a distillate of the politics of various comprehensive views. It includes, to some degree at least, comprehensive views themselves. It's not merely a distillate of moral beliefs about politics, it includes comprehensive views themselves. In this sense, what I would like to propose is a partially comprehensive consensus. The defender of political liberalism who admits that the consensus is partially comprehensive can still insist, nonetheless, on the duty, at least a prima facie duty, to form and enact coercive policy only on the basis of the consensus. For there, within the consensus, all parties find the shared grounds at any one time, in light of which they are willing to obey the law. Citizens can and should fully discuss their full comprehensive views when debating the moral issues of the day. And Rawls, of course, in his developed views, allows for comprehensive considerations to be brought into the public square as long as, quote unquote, one is ready and able, and others say one actually provides reasons from the consensus. When legal policy is itself at stake, in order not to inflict alienating coercion, the various parties are content to work within the consensus. They suffer no loss of integrity, for their comprehensive views are wholeheartedly and extensively related to all of life, including politics. Thank you.
Thank you, members of the panel. We will now take the break that I indicated.
I recall there's a letter by Thomas Jefferson sent to a rabbi in Philadelphia who apparently Thomas Jefferson visited with this rabbi. And Thomas Jefferson then received lots of information about history of Judaism and so forth. And he wrote back to this Rabbi Noah, and I forgot his last name, but he said to him, basically, I appreciate all the information that you gave me about the history of Judaism and all of this. And it affirms in my mind the notion that I have that every sect, when it's in minority, thinks that it's oppressed, and when it's in the majority, oppresses others. And I thought that was a very apt statement to prelude my question, which is, Mr. Cohen mentioned the Israeli Declaration of Independence. The Israeli Declaration of Independence is not a legal document. It is not bound, it is not a law in the state of Israel to follow the Declaration of Independence. Israel has a set of basic laws, and that's what Israeli society follows. And those basic laws are very racist and discriminatory. They include things like that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people everywhere. Any Jew in the world is owner of the land of Israel and can automatically become a citizen of the state regardless of where they are. They are Am Israel, people of Israel. Israel is not the only democracy in the Middle East. In fact, it has laws that are very, very racist by their nature. They include aspects that no other nation has. No other nation defines itself as a nation for a particular religion. Not Saudi Arabia even, which is a very theocracy of medieval nature. It doesn't say that it's a land for the Muslim people everywhere and any Muslim can come and acquire automatic citizenship and live on land of native people who are Christians and Muslims. This is, to me, to allude to Israel as a democracy, let alone the only democracy, forgetting countries like Turkey, of course, and Lebanon, and many others that are democratic, is to me is anathema as a Palestinian, certainly, to say that.
First of all, let me begin with the issue of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is not a legal constitutional document, but the Israeli Supreme Court over the last decade has treated the Declaration of Independence as a document that corrects actions that are not consistent with it, and that it has authority over all of the other basic laws. And in that way, it has attempted, the Supreme Court, to make of the Declaration of Independence and its insistence on equal treatment of all peoples in the country a constitutional-based document. Now, it isn't, as I said, the same as a constitutional document, but they have tried to make it an underpinning of all the basic laws. The issue of, the fundamental issue, though, that you raise is the one that is often raised in relationship to Israel, and that is, how can it be a state that belongs not only to the citizens of that state, but also to all the Jewish people? And that is a fundamental aspect of the nature of the peculiarity of Judaism as a religion that also has associated with the people. Now, when Israel was created, the notion was that since Jews were not accepted as equal citizens in other countries, many other countries, they would have a place where they could have a refuge. Now, the question of whether or not that is still necessary in 2006 is a complicated question which Israelis debate all the time. Right now, the refugees that come to Israel are mostly from the ex-Soviet Union, and some also coming from Ethiopia. And whether or not they are refugees in the sense that the refugees were after World War II it's a fine distinction, but it's maybe important. I think the issue is not really fundamentally whether Jews in other parts of the world have the right to make a decision to go to live in Israel and become citizens after 6 months or 2 years, instead of other people who go to live in Israel have to take 3 years to become citizens. I don't think that's the fundamental thing. The fundamental thing is whether or not there's going to be a possibility for Palestinians to have their own national political existence in a nation state that belongs to them, in which they have full rights. That's going to be the fundamental question. If there is an insistence on not accepting the identity of Israel as it defines itself, that is going to delay the process of Palestinian statehood emerging. It's not, I think, a good strategy to follow. I think the better strategy to follow is to insist that whatever rights Israelis insist upon for themselves, they should also make sure that the Palestinians have for themselves. That's the critical question. That if Israel has the right to have a state, Palestinians should have the right to have a state. If the Israelis have the right to have Jews come to live in Israel, the Palestinians should have the right to have Palestinians come from anywhere to live in the Palestinian state.
I'm not quite sure how to ask this question, but I think the gist I want to ask for anyone on the panel is, what role theology should play in the themes we're talking about, reconciliation, deliberation? Because, I mean, I take it's, theology occurs in a context, and the work of the two plenary speakers seems to be trying to mend a kind of conversational breakdown in a lot of the religious traditions, arguing for either a more sophisticated approach to Islam or to Christianity. And part of that emphasis has, in both plenary speakers, seems to be on religious education. And that is different, I think, that in universities, religion usually oscillates between reductionist views or essentialist views. In the media, it becomes a form of entertainment where you have certain privileged speakers from either the right or the left who may or may not have any theological background, but are anointed to represent certain religious traditions. And we've talked about scholars, we've talked about clergy, we've talked about politicians, we've talked about the current political context. But I guess the question is, in the long run, what role do theological ideas like the doctrine of the two, or the mystical unity of being, or things like this matter? And today, as a matter of strategy, what should be the sites for reconciliation? The university, divinity schools, churches, the media, politics, governments, and how maybe this Frank Griffel talked about the three estates. I've really been thinking about the fourth estate, the way in which the media frames so many of the discussions of interreligious dialogue, Islam, Christianity, democracy, and the images of those things. Strategically, how should we think about going about enriching deliberation and conversation? And especially in that context, what role you think theology should play? Because I've heard a little bit today of the notion that theology is either a cover for political gain, or can be reduced to questions of economics or politics, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm just, maybe this is a self-interested question for somebody interested in the history of theological ideas. In the long run, should that be the site where we look at? Because it seems to me so contingent about the current expression of American Christianity. The religious right, 50 years from now, is going to look very different. It's even emerging to break down. Jerry Falwell is not representative of American Christianity, even of American evangelicalism. So in the long run, I guess this question is, what role you think does theology matter in terms of reconciliation? Or is it, how does it matter for structures of feeling and structures of thinking and developing virtues that allow for the kind of relief of tension that you eloquently, Mr. Cohen eloquently presented? I think that, sorry if that's just all over the place, but I think that hopefully the general thrust is there.
I'm going to give you only a partial answer. There's an old story, a Talmudic story, about a man coming to a rabbi and saying that he wanted to learn all about Judaism while standing on one foot. And he's told, after people won't do it, one rabbi does say to him, love thy neighbor as thyself. And then he says something that's very important and often forgotten. He says, go and study. And I felt a great affinity to what Professor Zaman was talking about, because what he was saying was that we have to understand that these are very complex religious traditions, and we shouldn't try to oversimplify what they are and how they have been studied and understood over centuries of deep thought, scholarly approaches, religious approaches, clergy studying them and sermonizing about them. When he talked about the complexity of how one focuses on a passage in the Quran or a legal doctrine in Islam, very familiar to me. And my answer to your question is that if we go deeper into the fundamentals of these religious traditions, I believe that we will start to find some elements of deeper commonality and shared search for the truth and spiritual search that go beyond where we are today, where we have very simple stereotypes of each other. And with those stereotypes, we are able to pursue and maintain our conflict without any difficulty. The idea that we're going to go from these simple notions to wiping out the religious commitments of people, I think is simply foolish. It's not going to happen, and it won't happen. But if we perhaps create conditions under which people who are serious about their religious traditions and religious documents and their sacred texts will learn to study with each other seriously, I think they may begin to find that there are some things that they really can understand about each other. The complexity of the understanding of sacred texts in the history of these three religious traditions over centuries of study different scholarly traditions, different legal traditions, is a fascinating matter. And I think that if there began to be a few people in each of these faiths who came to understand their own faith and the others with some depth, we would begin to have some models of people in our societies who could talk with faith and knowledge about their own faith and about others in a way that increased respect and increased the willingness to live with the other and not live against the other only. So my sense is it's not exactly an answer to your question about theology itself, but it is an answer to your question about the need for deeper knowledge, learning, and teaching about our faiths to each other. This is, I think, an essential responsibility. And I think that divinity schools can no longer justify in this contemporary world a situation in which people go through the training to become religious leaders and learn only about the religious tradition in which they are going to serve. It's essential that when they go out to preach and teach, they be able to preach and teach respect of the other faiths. That in moments of crisis in the world community, there should be a cadre of people of some spiritual depth and some deep knowledge who can talk to their flock and to the world, and sometimes even on the media, in a way which evokes respect and patience with the other, and not an ignorant simplicity. We don't have that today. We don't have that today.
Before you ask, Joe, I want to respond briefly.
I'm getting ready to push
Okay.
on. Let me do this thing, Toby. Go ahead.
I want to take Eric's question in a little different direction. And if I can get to where I want to go, I want to raise a question about the value of this activity here and what we are doing. Now, I take it when you talk about the value of theology, you are, as you went on, I think, to indicate that you're talking about the value of what one might call academic theology, the kind of thing done by professionals, people who are trained and paid and have a place now, characteristically, at least in the Christian West, in universities, places like Yale. And I think this is extremely important. There's a great promise and a great danger in academic theology. The promise, the necessity of academic, well, I don't want to say necessity, but the great value of, we got along, primitive people got along well before they had universities. But the value of academic reflection is related to the value of the university in general, is that it helps to facilitate healthy growth. Any tradition has to remain alive. It has to grow. It has to develop. If it ceases to grow, it dies. And I think that academic theology can foster that growth. It can help to elaborate in intelligible and useful ways the charismatic core of faith, the central, salvific experience that fuels the faith. It can help people who are moved by that, those convictions, to incorporate elements from the world, the technological developments, intellectual developments, evolutionism, creationism. It can also help, and this I think is very relevant, was very predominant in the discussion earlier, the second panel. It can help religious believers distinguish between the charismatic core defining faith commitments and the cultural accoutrements are, the context in which the faith develops. That's all a part of allowing for critical, constructive growth. At the same time, there's a real danger from academic theology. And it was Gramsci's notion of indigenous intellectuals. The problem with academics, and I think this is very, very striking in the Western world since the Schleiermacher and the rise of modernist theology, which I've always had I've been raised Pentecostal fundamentalist and so forth. I have a sort of sensitivity about these matters. The problem, I think, is that academic theologians get moved more by concerns about the culture despisers of religion than they do about the charismatic core of their faith. And when that happens, then we have potential very real problems. And then instead of keeping the tradition alive, they encourage alienation. Well, I guess that's I say with regard to this context, I always like to, wherever I am or whatever I'm involved, I like sometimes to step back and just say, what am I doing here? What are people doing here? Why are people showing up? Why do people discipline themselves to sit here and they sort of burn the calories to make the intellectual effort? What are we doing? Well, one thing we're doing, people come because they care about the issue, they want to understand it better and so forth. But it's also the case that this is the way we make our living. And we make a very good living. We are among the highly privileged of the world. And we have to not forget that. And we, just like we want to encourage the fundamentalists to be aware of the cultural conditions of their beliefs, so they will think critically and not just take what's in the Bible or the Quran literally. So we have to be aware that our own beliefs and values, our explications, are also driven by our cultural context and self-interest. I think that academics need to be careful that they provide a place, give a voice to the ordinary people. So when I envisioned Yale as a place where we could have dialogue between Muslims and Christians and Jews, I would hope it would include academics, across the board, but also some ordinary people too. Let them speak up, and if they say some crazy things, well, good, makes it interesting, and maybe they will learn something and we will learn.
One of my motivations too was academic theology, but also whether or not more theology is what we need, not less. And I'm not sure where I fit on this, because sometimes when I see the kind of theology being expressed, and this just might be elitist academic attitude, but certainly when I hear Christians talking about the Pauline theology of Israel and talking about their relationship with Judaism, and then contrasting it to Christian attitudes towards Islam, that it stokes the flames of intolerance rather than moves it beyond it. And yet I want to applaud the effort to think theologically rather than simply sort of using political tropes or things like that. And so,
Richard done some wonderful things, but I want to come back to Mr. Cohen, whose work I've admired over a long time in reading your articles here and there, and observations. A couple of comments. One, there is the problem of ignorance. It's been my pleasure, and I guess burden, to have been involved in a lot of administrative leadership in a couple of seminaries and university. And almost 25 years ago, it was my conviction that Islam was there, existing, relative to the United States, church, as something utterly unknown. And I tried to find people who could come into our academic institutions and teach us about Islam. Okay? So the ignorance is terrific about just what the differences are within Islam. It's kind of maybe like the ignorance maybe some Muslims have about Christianity, okay? Now, the problem, however, is mere knowledge of Islam. And as illuminating as Professor Zema was today, and helped me overcome a lot of ignorance, okay? Mere awareness of what the other folks are about doesn't itself result in moral improvement. There's no necessary gain in that, except an accumulation of knowledge. So the theological question that Eric rightly raises here is that as we think about these folks, these matters as religious tradition and the politics involved in it, it's important that we be very self-consciously Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or whatever variation there might be with any of those traditions. Very important, because interfaith dialogue is only going to progress not by virtue of all of us transcending our particularities, but coming to grips with it. We must not expect Christians entering a conversation with Muslims that they're to give up their Muslimhood and rise above in sort of a John Hickeyan way to some sort of higher level of transcendental reflection, okay? We've got to encounter Muslims as Muslims, Christians as Christians. And the theological exchange there is what's really important. What I've been trying to teach students for about 3 decades or more, Christians, is basically when we enter into interfaith dialogue, we know with unerring certainty that the folks in the other traditions, whatever the other traditions are, that they are our brothers and sisters. I mean, that with unerring certainty, that's a construal of the faith that is ineradicable. And so that's how you enter into it. So there's already a moral construal deep in the theology as to who the others are. And it seems to me, if we could carry that on, at least Christianly understood, and I think in other faiths as well, we might have some extraordinary things sort of come to develop. Okay?
I just wanted to say that I think Imam Hindi is such a figure that Stephen Cohen was talking about. Moments ago, I said to him, I think the monotheistic tradition, I think in some sense responding to what you said, Eric, that theology is the problem, not the solution. And I sort of laid that on him. I said, you know, Abraham took his son, his only son whom he loved, and almost killed him. This is a problem. And he quickly said to me, you know, there are these Muslims that say, was it Ishmael, Jews, Isaac? That's not the question at all. He said to me, it's a metaphor. Isaac is the ego. The question is whether we religionists will slaughter our ego for the glory of God. And of course that terrifies us. Well, that move, that interpretive move on his part, lifts you, I think, from the parochial traditions. And in that sense, the Hickeyan move that you dismissed can't be thrown away too quickly. There has to be a capacity to I'm embodied as a Jew, a member of the Jewish people, but if I don't see beyond the Jewish people, hearing God say to Abraham, you shall be a blessing unto all the families of the earth.
Yeah, let me just press that a bit. The problem about the Hickeyan position is the assumption we're all saying the same thing. That assumption is so grammatically and logically misleading, okay? Because it is immediately, let's take the Orthodox Jew. Now, the Reformed Jew might say something like that, okay? Because I've been in Jewish-Christian dialogue for a long time. The Reformed Jew might say something like that. The Orthodox Jew is not going to say something like that. And sort of impose that as the paradigm for how we enter into conversation seems to me dramatically diminishing to the particularity of the various traditions. That's the point I wanted to make. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me Hick simply is not going to be the basis on which we can view each other and construe each other and enter into that kind of conversation. Now, that doesn't preclude that we might learn a great deal about each other as we enter into the conversation and see sort of things we have in common and so on. In fact, we hope that happens. But okay, that's just the word about the Hickeyan.
That exegesis doesn't have to rely on Hickeyan assumptions.
No, it doesn't.
Something that's shared by all, but not be Hickeyan.
Right. I think I misused the term. Thank you.
I think it was a Jewish scholar who commented that too much Christian-Jewish dialogue consists of Jews who don't really believe in Judaism getting together with Christians who don't really believe in Christianity and discovering how much they have in common. But that's not my question. My question is for Professor Cohen and Rabbi Ponet. When I think about Muslim-Christian reconciliation, and I'm very moved by what Professor Cohen you said about digging deeply in the roots of the three Abrahamic faiths and looking for the resources, the common ground that can construct that reconciliation. When I think about that in reference specifically to Muslim-Christian reconciliation, I immediately think of Jesus as a point of common ground, which is not to say that Muslims and Christians agree about everything about Jesus. Obviously, they have some very significant differences about his ontological status. And I don't want to sweep those under the carpet as unimportant. They're very important to me as a Christian. But nonetheless, Muslims and Christians would agree that Jesus' teachings and the example of his life are normative for us. They would agree that we fall short in the extent to which we follow those teachings and that example in the way we treat one another, and that if Muslims and Christians would follow the teachings and example of Jesus more faithfully in our treatment of one another, the world would be a much better place. It'd probably even be better for Jews, too, if we would do that. And my question is, I'm very conscious in wanting to include Jewish voices in that conversation, that Jesus is a much more problematic figure for the Jewish community, whereas Muslims agree with Christians in seeing Jesus as Messiah, and seeing Jesus as prophet, and seeing Jesus as infallible. For the Jewish community, obviously, if you, when you were a little kid, you got beat up by other kids who were calling you a Christ killer, then you're not going to have warm, fuzzy feelings about the name Christ, and certainly not about assertions of Jesus' messianic status. And again, I don't want to sweep that under the carpet because, as a Christian, I think that his messianic status is very important. But my question is, do you think it is possible for the Jewish community, without getting into those issues of messianic status, ontological status, and all of that stuff, to say the Jesus of the Gospels, who was, after all, Jewish, when he said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," when he said, "Judge not lest you be judged," remove the logs from your own eyes before you remove the specks from other people's eyes, the person who would be first among you must be the servant of all. Is that someone that, how do you feel, both you personally as Jews, and do you think is the wider feeling in the Jewish community about including that in discussion about reconciliation among the followers of the three Abrahamic faiths?